Q1 How would you handle a situation where a child component needs to communicate with its parent component? To handle a situation where a child component needs to communicate with its parent component, you can pass a callback function from the parent component to the child component as a prop. The child component can then call this function to send data to the parent component. Q2 How would you optimize the performance of a React application that's rendering a large number of components? To optimize the performance of a React application that's rendering a large number of components, you can use techniques like virtualization, memoization, and code splitting. Virtualization involves rendering only the visible components on the screen, while memoization involves caching the results of expensive calculations. Code splitting involves breaking up the application into smaller chunks that can be loaded on demand. Q3 How would you implement conditional rendering in a React component? To implement conditional rendering in a React component, you can use the ternary operator or the logical and operator to conditionally render elements based on a condition. For example, you can use condition null to conditionally render a component. Q4 How would you implement a controlled input in a React form? To implement a controlled input in a React form, you can set the value of the input element to a state variable and update the state variable whenever the input changes. You can also add an onChange event listener to the input element to update the state variable. Q5 How would you handle asynchronous data loading in a React component? To handle asynchronous data loading in a React component, you can use the useEffect hook to fetch data from an API or other data source. You can also use state variables to keep track of the loading status and the data. Q6 How would you implement client-side routing in a React application? To implement client-side routing in a React application, you can use a routing library like React Router. React Router allows you to define routes and their corresponding components, and it also provides navigation components like link and navlink. Q7 How would you implement internationalization in a React application? To implement internationalization in a React application, you can use a library like React International. React International provides components for formatting dates, numbers, and text messages in different languages. Q8 How would you handle errors and exceptions in a React component? To handle errors and exceptions in a React component, you can use try-catch blocks to catch errors and handle them gracefully. You can also use error boundaries to catch errors in child components and prevent them from crashing the whole application. Q9 How would you implement state management in a React application using Redux or Context API? To implement state management in a React application using Redux or Context API, you can create a global state object that holds the application state. You can then use the provider component to make the state available to all child components, and use the useSelector hook to read the state and the useDispatch hook to update the state. Q10 How would you test a React component using Jest and Enzyme? To test a React component using Jest and Enzyme, you can create a test file that imports the component and uses the Enzyme API to simulate user interactions and check the output. You can also use Jest to test asynchronous code and to generate code coverage reports.